Thank you for the floor. Elaborating on new security architecture and what is needed, let me structure my presentation in 3 basic dimensions. The first one is that this war will have far-reaching consequences that will influence not only the security environment, it will influence the warfare as such. And it will also influence the strategic thinking, and not only strategic thinking of us, it will influence also strategic thinking of our enemies. And we need to elaborate on this. The second dimension is the future of NATO. Even before this war, there were a couple of difficult tasks ahead of us in order to keep alliance relevant on both sides of the Atlantic. And not all the tasks were fulfilled, and we have already new tasks coming from this war, and the adaptation process of NATO will need to reflect also the outcome of this war. So this is the second dimension. And the third one is that, speaking about the EU and NATO, we need to strive for complementarity of the both organizations that are already security providers, but we should omit any unnecessary competition between these two. Okay, the first dimension that I said, the consequences of the war on the environment, warfare, and the strategic thinking. I've been dealing with the resilience of the NATO eastern flank for the last couple of years, and therefore I studied Russian military strategy and Russian doctrine. Russian military strategy and also the doctrine was based on what we call limited warfare, because Russia precisely knows that it cannot sustain the longer fighting, very intensive fighting for the long term, and it also lacks the capabilities to project power. So they implied this limited warfare actually in the Ukrainian conflict as well. The thing is that it is based on their ability to very rapidly mobilize the combat force, as well as to mobilize the entire state capacities, entire state administration system, and to inflict the strategic shock to the enemy right at the very beginning, and then, and this is very important, then to terminate conflict very quickly according to their political notes. This is actually what the doctrine and what their strategy is about. And this was actually what all these huge exercises, Zapad exercises, if you call, was about, 2017, 2021. If you look at the content of those exercises, Russians did not train their ability to launch the conflict, because they know they can launch the conflict. They trained their ability to terminate conflict very quickly according to their political notes. And they tried, according the doctrine and the strategy at the very beginning of the conflict. So the first 48 hours of the conflict were really critical. So it was sleepless night for us that observed the conflict. They were just, very close to achieve the goal. They had already Hostomel airport. They had a couple of critical juncture around Kiev. They launched attack on Mykolaiv, and they had already a combat force inside Kiev. They had a combat force inside Kiev going for President Zelensky. But it failed. This 48 hours, it failed due to different reasons. We can come to Q&A. The next month, they still try to stick to their doctrine and to the military strategy. They launched a pincer movement. If you recall the map from that time, they launched different attacks from the different direction. It was also, according they note, to try to enforce negotiation to get the enemy down. But it revealed very quickly that those different directions of the attack did not cooperate with each other. They competed. So it revealed only the weaknesses in the chain of command. And I'm saying this because, and then after the big battle on around Kiev, Chernigov, and Sumy, it was clear they're gonna lose, and they will lose, because they had already systemic weaknesses of the army, and since then, that they abandoned also the strategy and the doctrine. They were forced by the Ukrainians to abandon the strategy. It's only deteriorate the systemic weaknesses of the army. But the importance is that they will take a lesson. They will take a lesson from this failure, and not only them. The Chinese will take a lesson from this failure, and any other adversary. And we are actually in interesting times that we will need, after this war, thorough stock taking, what kind of capabilities are there on the other side, and what kind of intents. And there are many unknowns, but what is known for sure, I think, it seems to me at least, that next 5 or 10 years, they will not be sending, if they stay as a coherent state and as an enemy, they will not send tanks. They will not send armored brigades, because it failed. By the way, the Chinese are already adjusting their strategy. So there will be a political tasking for the military planners will be to launch such an attack, kinetic or non-kinetic one, that still leaves the dilemma for the Western leadership whether to fight or not to fight, because they know it will be difficult dilemma. So you can envisage rather some, let's say, air blockade, naval blockade, quick assault with rapid withdrawal of the forces, well below Article number 5. Because they have a lesson that if democratic countries are fighting, it is not Chief of General Staff, it is not Minister of Defense, it is politicians who decide. And politicians are also dependent on public support. Politicians are not very eager to take a political risk if they do not know whether it will pay off for them or not. So this will be, I think, political task for the military planners, well below Article number 5. If you look on our preparation, that we have a new troops, we have a new brigades in Baltic states, in Poland, even Corps Command in Poland, and new troops in Romania, is preparation for the past war, for the current war. We need to be prepared for the past war, but not for this is not preparation for the future. So what I think should be aware that next time our adversary will challenging our political cohesion and political decision-making process at the very beginning, because it precisely knows that we have the most robust military force, and it will always be the case. But the political decision-making process, it can be the bottleneck. So we need now, in all countries, to review our strategic documents. You mentioned here that Germany is preparing new security strategy. Czech Republic launched the process of preparation of new security and defense strategy. We need to prepare those documents, but it should not be exercised among the experts. Politicians need to be familiarized with those strategies, because they will need to have clear picture from the very beginning of the conflict what to do. Because, as I said, next time it will be well below Article number 5, and we need, let's say, Civ Mill strategic thinking and empathy-driven strategic thinking. We need to concentrate on the lesson of our enemies, because they have lessons. And steadily in Moscow, military psychologists are working, and they are observing us. We can come to close this. In my understanding, pure political solution is not sufficient. We need to have a political military solution. The second dimension, NATO. as I said, even before this war, it was clear that the decisive phenomenon for the next security environment will be continuation of competition of powers. Regardless who is in the United States, whether you define it as a big power competition or different kind of competition, but competition of powers, and NATO need to find a role in this competition of powers. So it was clear even before the war that NATO, for instance, need a new naval strategy, because the Navy strategy of NATO is from 2011. It needs to invest more in Navy. It needs to have a Black Sea strategy. And it needs to also speed up decision-making process at the beginning of the conflict, and also fourth generation process. Because if you have outside, NRF forces and the spearhead forces, if you need to generate force, you need a standard way. It can take weeks to generate the force, right? So there were a couple of tasks before the war. The war added up new task. This was mentioned here, the need to, let's say, boost substantially our capacity of our military industry. This is clear, and it will be very difficult, by the way, for Germany, for instance, but other countries too. But at the same time, we need to reflect the outcome of this war, because the outcome of this war will be that Russia will be defeated. The Russian army will be defeated. It will be degraded. And it was, by the way, the clear definition of the US war goals. Minister Austin and Minister Blinken said clearly, visiting Kiev, that the US war goal is to defeat the Russian army in such a way that it will not pose the threat for its neighbors. So my reading from this statement of the war goals is the next time United States will be expecting that the European part of NATO is already capable of dealing with Russia threat by its own means, with some always support of the United States, right? So this should be this should be reflected by the NATO. It was a lot of effort, a lot of money invested in the defeat of the Russian army. So next time, and it should happen within NATO, so increase European level of ambition, but within NATO, not European army, within NATO. And there are a couple of tasks in this regard. One of them is, for instance, that, in the reality, the majority of combat troops in NATO are European ones, not the US ones, the European ones. But the thing is that European countries are not capable of deploy their forces and keep them in the battlefield to sustain them in the fight without the US logistics, because European armies are lacking combat support and combat service support, all this life support, logistic, ISR. If you look at the mission in Afghanistan or NATO, it was quite, Afghanistan and Iraq, it was quite successful NATO missions, but they would collapse immediately without the US logistics. And this needs to change. We need to invest in these enablers, in this combat support service. And by the way, I think that the framework nation concept, the German framework nation concept, can be a solution, part of the solution. Because the defined goal of the framework nation concept is to prepare robust forces, right, corps level, up to 1/3 of the ambition, but also to invest in this combat support service. Czech Republic is, by the way, leader of one capability cluster of the life support. So we need to invest in this in order to say to the Americans that we are already, after the war, where the Russian army was degraded, that we are able to deal with Russian threat ourselves within NATO, with only some support. Because if we will still claim more and more troops here, I mean, Czech Republic, Poland, Romania, Baltic states, the United States will leave the troops here because they will never abandon Europe unsafe. Never. It's always partner number one for the United States. But it means NATO will not have a role. It will not have a role as a partner for global issues. So United States need to invest more, let's say, in the Pacific, but also taking into account the Chinese are adjusting. It will be very demanding. And I think we need to find this role for NATO in this global competition. If we do not find this role, I'm afraid NATO will lose in the long term its relevance on the both sides of the Atlantic. The last one, and sorry, do I have a, yeah, it's not too long. The last one, complementarity between the EU and the NATO. It is now frequently debated whether EU should increase its capability and so on and so forth. I think we need to distinguish clearly what for there is a EU military security dimension and what for is NATO. And it is not contradiction, it is complementarity. I think EU should concentrate on crisis management, on those CSDP missions, both civilian and military one, and it needs to concentrate on improvements of the CSDP system, because the spreading, let's say, enforcing also security around and stability around Europe, it also contributes to the safety of Europe. It's not only collective defense. And I think CSDP is a really unique tool because in the planning process, you can plan for both civilian and military mission. Only then, later in the process, you decide whether you will send a police mission or military mission. You can also join the CSDP missions with justice and home affairs tools, development tools. That means it is sustainable for post-conflict reconstruction. So this very unique tool, we need to increase our, let's say, ability to plan and conduct military missions, military CSDP missions. So like the military planning and conducting capabilities should be equal to the civilian planning and conducting capabilities. And we should do utmost in order to omit any unnecessary competition between the CSDP dimension and NATO collective defense. Very concretely, there is what is called a capability development plan. So last edition of the capability development plan is from 2018, and we are now in the process of preparing a new capability development plan. And I think that the new edition of the capability development plan, regardless of the war, should have the same philosophy like the capability development plan from 2011. That means it is driven by shortfalls defined by those CSDP missions, like a strategic lift, life support, ISR, and those kind of shortfalls, and not to try to incorporate in this capability development plan hardware that is needed for collective defense, like vessels, jets, hypersonic missiles. It should be exclusively in NATO and financial resources for NATO. And I'm saying here this because I'm pretty aware that there will be attempts to move in this new capability development plan some money for, let's say, collective defense capabilities. And because it's Chatham House and I'm freelancer, I think we will face steadily French attempts to get in this capability development plan really these capabilities that should be exclusively for NATO. And there is particular role of Germany in our countries to prevent this. So the main thesis is complementarity, not competition within the NATO. To sum up, all the three dimensions said that NATO as the strongest alliance of the world militarily, but in terms of its political cohesion, and ability of the political decision-making of the process, it is a different story, and our adversary knows it. But it is not only fault of politicians if there would be some failure. Politicians need to feel support for their conduct by civil society, academia, by the public. So therefore, meetings like this that will somehow spread knowledge about the really strategic importance of coping with the new world, because I think after the world, it will be a new world, is very useful one, and I'm grateful that I can be here. Thank you.